Reports from Sportsnet indicate that Patrick Marleau likely is done with the Toronto Maple Leafs and will be traded this summer to a team in the Western Conference. We also have information to suggest that the Calgary Flames are looking to move a defenseman, and we also expect the Vancouver Canucks and the Philadephia Flyers to be very active in and around the draft and during the offseason. We'll get into all the latest coming up next. Welcome back to Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. During last night's second intermission during the Bruins and Blues Stanley Cup Finals game, there was some information revealed by Nick Kypreos of Sportsnet indicating that he has information to suggest that Patrick Marleau is indeed done with the Toronto Maple Leafs, that his family is moving back to San Jose, and that he will be traded to a team in the Western Conference. Now, we had reports the day before indicating that the Kings and Leafs had discussed a Marleau trade. That information came from Pierre LeBrun, who works for TSN, and it looks as though that there might be more to this, and there might be some more teams here in the mix. Now, Nick Kypreos referenced the LA Kings, the Colorado Avalanche, and the Arizona Coyotes. I probably also wouldn't completely rule out the San Jose Sharks, but I think that a lot of that's going to be dependent on what else happens with a lot of their free agents. Of course, they've got Carlson, Thornton, and Pavelski all pending UFAs here, so it's going to depend on their cap situation and what money they can kind of fit into the salary cap situation that they're dealing with. But overall, I wouldn't completely rule that out. So it does look as though Patrick Marleau will waive his no-move clause to go back to one of those Western Conference teams so he can play as close as possible to his family since they're moving back to California. Now, of course, looking at these teams, we discussed the other day with the LA Kings, it didn't really make a lot of sense from their situation. Obviously, they need to get younger, faster, more skilled. Marleau doesn't exactly fall into that. I mean, obviously, there is a connection to Todd McLellan, who's their new head coach, who was a coach of Marleau's a long time with the Sharks. Of course, even general manager Rob Blake played for the Sharks at the end of his career, so of course there'd be a connection there as well. But at the same time, overall for the Kings, I'm not really sure it makes a ton of sense to bring in Marleau. And based on their cap situation, it would be hard for them to work out a deal in that regard as well. They would certainly have to move out a couple of contracts for it to make sense. And based on other reports I'm seeing, that after the original discussions, that there really doesn't seem to be much of a fit there. And I would be quite surprised at this point to see a Toronto-LA trade involving Marleau going to the Kings. Now, taking a look at the Coyotes and the Avalanche that were suggested, the Coyotes as well don't have a ton of cap space. I know that they do want to add some scoring into their top six. That's mostly what they're looking to do this summer. I mean, their goaltending was pretty good last year. Overall, their team defense wasn't too bad either, but they certainly need to score more, and I'm not really sure that Marleau is the answer to that equation as well. I mean, I guess if there was a big enough chunk of salary retained by Toronto, then maybe, but I'm not really sure the Leafs are going to be looking to do that. In order to free up even more cap space, I would think the more likely scenario would be the Leafs attaching another pick or prospect or roster player even to Marleau to send him to whatever team he ends up going to free up as much space as possible to accommodate the other signings that they would like to be able to make here with Mitch Marner and the other RFAs. So I don't really see the Coyotes really being a great fit either. Out of the three teams that were mentioned by Kypreos, the only team to me that really makes any amount of sense is Colorado, and the only reason it makes sense is because they have a whole lot of cap space to work with. Now, of course, Mikko Rantanen needs a new contract. He's had a couple of really big seasons, so you know he's going to get a significant raise and a fairly significant contract, likely end up being the highest paid player on the team, given the value contract, we can call it now, that Nate MacKinnon has. Obviously, when MacKinnon signed his contract, he hadn't quite exploded to be the player he is today, so now that looks like a big-time bargain, very team-friendly contract. So you know Rantanen's going to end up getting paid more, but Steve, even after that, they're going to have all kinds of space. We've talked about the Avalanche as maybe being a player going after another RFA, one of the teams who could consider using the offer sheet, for example, but they could, I guess, look to maybe bring in some veteran leadership like Marleau. They do have a lot of young forwards. And there could be an argument there to maybe suggest that it might make some sense. It's only for 1 year. There's only 1 year left on the contract, so it's not a long-term commitment. And if they can convince the Leafs to attach another player to that trade that they can use longer term, maybe like a Connor Brown or another prospect or get a high pick or something, then it might be worth their while to really consider making that deal. I mean, the Avalanche are a team on the rise. The last 2 years, they've kind of built upon year after year, made the playoffs each time, went a little bit further this year than last. So they're certainly a team that's, like I said, they're on the rise. They're building themselves up here. They're working their way, being kind of considered more of a contender for the Western Conference, and adding some veteran leadership like Marleau, even for the 1 year, could kind of help guide some of their younger players along the way. Might not be a terrible idea, especially, like I said, if they can get a sweetener in the mix here to kind of make it worth their while. But I guess we'll see. But according to Kiprios and Sportsnet, Marleau is basically all about done with the Leafs. Now, of course, Patrick Marleau has been very much a mentor for young players like Mitch Marner and Austin Matthews during his time here with the Maple Leafs. I mean, they oftentimes kind of refer to him as their dad. Like, he's basically been a father figure in a sense. They've become very close with his family and his children. So I know that obviously Marleau is not going to be making this decision, very easily. It's going to be a tough decision for him to leave Toronto. I really do think he likes it there. But if it only makes sense for him from a family perspective, then I'm sure that overall this very well could play itself out. And if he can go on to a Western Conference team, and they can also move defenseman Nikita Zaitsev, who we reported on the other day is wanting out of Toronto and going to a new market as well, then obviously that's going to go a really long ways to getting their other RFAs, their new contracts, and not really having to shed a whole lot of other players to kind of get everything under control here. Obviously, as we indicated going into the offseason, those were the two main contracts that the Leafs would need to move, but it might be very difficult in order to do that. But things as though are looking now that it might not be as hard as we thought. There might be more interest in these players to take them on. So let me know your thoughts and your opinions down in the comment section. Where do you think Patrick Marleau possibly ends up? And do you think any of the teams that Sportsnet's referring to here really truly make sense? In other news here, there's certainly some other teams expected to be quite busy. We have information and reports that suggest that the Calgary Flames are expected to try to move a defenseman. Yesterday we did a video discussing the latest updates to the TSN trade bait board by Frank Saravalli. Basically, his top players that he expects to be traded during the offseason. And there are a couple of Flames on there. Mostly, though, the main defenseman that's been mentioned is Travis Hamonic, but I also have other information that we've reported before suggesting maybe TJ Brody, and I have seen some reports indicating he's still being considered as well. So the Flames are looking to possibly shake up their back end. I do expect a fair bit of moves out of the Flames, though. It's not quite a given yet that their goaltending situation is going to be next year. Riddick likely is back, but obviously Mike Smith's a UFA. He may not return, so they may not have the same goalie tandem. I think they want to shake up their D-core. They'd probably love to rid themselves of that James Neal contract, because that's turned out to be, a very bad deal, but at the same time going to prove difficult. I think they would be more likely here to kind of rehabilitate the players, see if they can get them producing again in some capacities. But obviously they were linked to Jason Zucker as well in Minnesota, with potentially Frolik and Bennett going out the door to facilitate that trade. So we'll see here. The Flames are expected to be busy with a couple of different moves here over the offseason to shake things up. They had an awesome regular season, but did not have a good showing in the playoffs. And I think they've realized here some of the moves that they likely need to make this team even stronger going into next year. Now, also, the Philadephia Flyers are expected to be a very busy team this year. Now, recently we've talked about the possibility of them trading defenseman Shane Gostisbehere, and that certainly remains a possibility. There appears to be lots of interest in the young defender, and I do think they could get a pretty decent return. But apparently there's been reports as well indicating that the Flyers are toying with the idea of maybe trading their first-round selection. They do have a ton of young players already in their system, and if they can get a player that's already established, a little bit older, doesn't necessarily have to mean like an older veteran, but even somebody in their early to mid-20s who's a little bit more established and can have more of an impact right away, I do think GM Chuck Fletcher will be quite open to that possibility. Based on reports and recent interviews here with Fletcher, it does appear as though he intends to try to be aggressive this summer to make some upgrades to this team. Trading Gostisbehere is certainly one possibility, and trading this first-round pick appears to be another. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion and a given that he's going to trade the first-round pick, but he did indicate that he's certainly willing to listen to offers, and if the right offer comes along, like I said, with a player in the right age range that can help the team immediately and be a more of an impact in what they expect to get with this pick, then it's certainly something that they're going to consider. I mean, picking 11th overall isn't too bad. They likely are going to get a decent prospect. At least the odds are pretty good here. But obviously, it is likely that player would take a couple of years to have any kind of impact on their roster. And obviously, we saw a bit of a desire from this franchise to win more and now, not later. And that's kind of, I think, the impatience that led to the firing of Ron Hextall myself. I think Hextall did a really good job with the drafting and developing, but they've seen him as being too cautious and being too patient, too slow, and they wanted more results today, not 2-3 years down the road. So therefore, it would not be surprising to see Fletcher use some of the younger players already in their system or some of their picks to make some upgrades that will have more of an impact right away. I mean, if you look at some of their top players right now, they are getting a little bit older, like Claude Giroux, Jake Voracek, Sean Couturier. They're not old by any means, but they're certainly, creeping up there a little bit each year, and they certainly want to have the ability to win while they're still in their prime years still producing at good rates because they're big parts of this team. And obviously, once they start to decline, they need the next batch of young players to take over, but it's certainly going to have an impact on how good the team is overall. So they do need to have some turnover in this roster in order to kind of rejuvenate it and get more of a win now mode. They do have lots of other prospects, like I mentioned, ready to jump in. But it's we'll see here what kind of moves Fletcher makes. But I guess let me know what you would like to see the Flyers obtain in a trade here. If they trade that first overall selection, number 11 overall, what do you think they should target in order to get a return to make that deal and get somebody in their lineup next year who's already established and can have an impact here right away? Now, lastly here, I want to touch on the Vancouver Canucks. A lot of the information and updates on the Canucks come from Jeff Patterson, who recently sat down and talked to Jim Benning and certainly trying to get some information on where the Canucks, their plans are for the offseason. I mean, it's not quite clear yet if defenseman Alex Edler will be returned. I know he did ask him about the possibility of re-signing him and how things are looking on that front. Certainly didn't get a ton of clear answers, but it looks as though one of the main sticking points to them signing Edler might be a combination of term and to trade protection in the contract. I mean, Alex Edler did have a no-trade clause before, and it's believed that he likely would like to have that again to have more control over his potentially being moved in the future. And the Canucks seem to be not so willing to hand that out this time. Obviously, the Canucks need to get younger, but at the same time, obviously, the Canucks are going through a youth movement, through a rebuild, but they need some veterans around. But they don't necessarily want to be tied to veterans for too long and have to protect them in the upcoming expansion draft for Seattle here, which is not in the too distant future. They have to protect Alex Edler in the expansion draft because of that no-trade clause. If they were to give him one like before, then that could cause problems to not being able to protect one of their other much younger defensemen that they would prefer to keep in that situation. So obviously, teams are certainly going to be a lot more picky with no-trade clauses for the next little while here as they prepare for that upcoming expansion draft. As we've seen with Vegas, there's a fair bit of players that fell into that category of having a no-move clause and had to be protected because of it, that certainly a lot of teams were not real thrilled about, and some of those players would have liked to have been exposed for Vegas to possibly consider taking. So, and then in this case, it's not quite clear if he returns. There's been other talk about maybe Tanev or Hutton possibly being moved as well. I do think that he wants to reshape the blue line for the Canucks for the upcoming year. Obviously, adding the young and dynamic Quinn Hughes will be a major help. Certainly benefit from having a veteran like Edler on the blue line. There's no doubt he could be of value, but obviously only for the right price. And of course, when it comes to Tanev, he's been having a lot of health issues. If they can move on from him, might not be terrible. And then you get some other younger players like Hutton, who's not far from unrestricted free agency, so they need to decide, are they going to tie themselves to this player longer term on an extension, or are they going to look to maybe move on and kind of reshape this blue line even further? Now, the other thing with the Vancouver Canucks is they're picking number 10 overall this year, and it is believed that Jim Benning is willing to listen to trade talk on that pick as well. So obviously, the teams that are real high in the draft certainly not likely to make any moves. I mean, it wouldn't rule it out completely, but when you get down to where the Flyers and the Canucks are, more towards that middle of the first round, there likely could be some movement here, because they might not have that impact player that they would have gotten possibly in the top 2 or even top 5. So the Canucks are certainly listening to offers. It's not quite clear exactly what they might want to return, but they're not going to move the pick unless they can get a deal they're very happy with here. But I do think Jim Benning wants to add a little bit more of a veteran presence to this team. They got a lot of young players, and I think that there is some pressure from ownership to win a little bit more now, be more competitive now, to be more relevant now, instead of just like the Flyers, very similar situation. I think ownership's getting a little antsy with the rebuild and kind of wants to progress things along. They got a lot of good young talent, and they need to surround them here with not necessarily older veterans, but like that mid-range, mid-20s type of guy who's been established and can produce and help the team here right away as well. So, of course, as always, I want to hear your thoughts and opinions on everything we discussed here today. There's still all kinds of speculation going around. The NHL has been very busy with a lot of trade talk, a lot of free agent rumors going around as well. The next few weeks should be very interesting. We're just under 3 weeks away now from the draft, obviously less than a month away from free agency. So there probably will be all kinds of chatter around what might happen. So it's going to be very interesting. We can discuss here in the comment section what everybody thinks is going to go down, and we'll have plenty to talk about over the next few weeks as we finally lead up to these events getting underway. If you're new to the channel, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and give the video a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.